My colleague, Henry Judy, couldn't join us today, and I do want to acknowledge his contribution to this work. I'm saying that because we have quite a bit of time this morning in this session. I can speak about it for as long as you want, but I'd like to leave some time open at the end for questions, and I would encourage you to ask questions along the way if they come up. So in the spirit of the survey nature of this symposium, I'm going to cover a lot of ground very quickly and from a perspective that is both at a very high level and perhaps somewhat distant, because I will be looking at these issues from primarily an international perspective. That's the one. Okay. This morning I'm wearing two hats. I have my World Bank hat. That's my day job. And a lot of the work that is reflected in this presentation stems from that work. I'm also wearing my ABA hat. I co-chair with Henry Judy, who I just mentioned, the Internet Governance Task Force of the Cyberspace Law Committee of the Business Law Section of the American Bar Association. Our mandate for the task force is stated here at the bottom of the slide. We're primarily an awareness-raising entity within the Cyberspace Law Committee. Our job is to inform our members what's going on internationally in the area of what we call Internet governance law, and that, I mean, these words are somewhat fungible. Internet governance, cybersecurity, informatics. I mean, some of it is a semantic battle that we fight all the time, but you'll see, I think, as we go through, that is actually one of the struggles that we have in crafting law in this area internationally, is that these concepts mean so many things to so many people. So I'm also wearing my ABA hat here today, and some of the work that will be reflected in the presentation also stems from that work that we've done in the ABA. We started out looking at one particular phenomenon that was happening in the world. That was something called the Internet Governance Forum, the IGF. The Internet Governance Forum was started about 6 or 7 years ago as an offshoot of a process at the United Nations called the World Summit on Information Society. The World Summit on Information Society was in a two-phase summit. First one was in 2003, the second was in 2005, and out of that summit emerged this thing called the Internet Governance Forum, primarily as a reaction to a very specific set of complaints or concerns by some governments about an entity called ICANN and its management of the domain name system. So I see some heads nodding. Is there anyone here who hasn't heard of ICANN? Okay, we'll talk later then. I'll come back and go into ICANN in a bit more detail. So has everyone heard of the domain name system? Heads nodding, okay. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. So the crux of the matter was that the domain name system, .org, .com, the two-letter country domains, the CCTLDs, was, under the Clinton administration, handed over to this California nonprofit corporation called ICANN. And there was an agreement between the U.S. Department of Commerce and ICANN to manage those resources. So the three things that ICANN does are really critical internet resources, the root servers on which the domain name system runs, the management of the domain name system, and related activities. So at the summit, there was this there were a lot of things discussed at the summit, all good things, mom, apple pie, that sort of stuff. But the key issue that emerged from it was this issue of government international participation in ICANN. And the US government at the time was unwilling to cede any control and instead agreed to this process called the Internet Governance Forum as kind of a safety release valve, so that all the pressure that was building around the fight and the discussion about who is going to be responsible for the domain name system was sort of pushed off to the side in this thing called the Internet Governance Forum. So this list is a list of the fora that have occurred to date, and we have, through the ABA, participated in each forum as it's gone through. And we started with a very broad concept of what does law mean in this space, what are the legal issues, and progressively we have refined that. In one session we talked about ICANN as a corporation and what could be done in terms of corporate law to change ICANN, to change the way the system is run. At our workshop in Vilnius in Lithuania, we were fortunate to have Vint Cerf on our panel talking about cybersecurity. Last year we talked about trends in internet governance and where that was going, and talked about things like open data and things like that, things that we touched upon, I think, later in the course of the 2 days. The interesting thing that, well, many interesting things, but one of the principal things that has emerged from the IGF is this concept of multi-stakeholder governance. And in a way, it's not that different from what we've seen here today. You have College of Law, you've got the College of Informatics, you've got speakers from around the world, from government, from the private sector, from academia, from the public sector, and all of them have a view on these issues. So in microcosm, this is what multi-stakeholderism is all about. This was elevated to a new level at the international stage through the Internet Governance Forum. So for the first time on a particular issue affecting a particular global issue, you had in the same room, speaking with the same level of credentials, people from the academic community, people from the technical community, people like me from international organizations, governments, et cetera, all having a say on what this is, what this means to have internet governance. In a way, looking back on it, it's almost natural because, as we'll see, there are so many different actors involved in cybersecurity and internet governance that would be almost inconceivable, one would say, to think that you wouldn't have all these different actors and players in the same room talking about the same stuff. Yet, and you'll see in the red here, yet there are a number of governments who are resisting this multi-stakeholder model. I won't name them here, we can discuss them later on perhaps, but there are some governments who wish to retain more control over the internet, and they have a very strong voice in the internet governance debate. Some of them might be surprising to you, but it's not a done deal. It's not necessarily something that everyone agrees with. So while the creation of the Internet Governance Forum was a result of a very emotional debate about who controls the internet, over the course of the 7 years of the Internet Governance Forum, the tone of the debate has come way down. The temperature has been reduced. And the first couple of years were all about ICANN and what ICANN bashing and people complaining about ICANN, people defending ICANN. And that has mostly gone away now. And so we're now talking about things, focusing on things in the Internet Governance Forum about privacy, authentication, identity management, cybersecurity, cybercrime, the whole panoply of issues involved. And every year we find that there are still more and more things that we need to address. Now our concern is obviously from a legal perspective, and so we're going to try and drill down to that in a little bit. Hank and I are writing a paper for the law review. We have about 25 pages. My apologies to the review for our tardiness and my gratitude for their patience in that regard. In the paper, what we're suggesting primarily is an almost rhetorical device for viewing this whole landscape of legal issues in the cybersecurity internet governance space, and we're calling them domains. And we didn't mean it in a cute way, like, you know, domain names and stuff like that, but we figured that there was a resonance there because of the vocabulary that already existed. But before I get into the specific domains, let me try and map out for you a little bit of why we got to that place. So this chart shows on the vertical axis the level of individual involvement in some of these internet governance activities, so going from the individual to the national to the international level. And then the horizontal axis shows, again, the level of government involvement in these different activities. So we see, for example, this is by no means exhaustive, standards, and we have someone speaking about standards later today, tomorrow? Tomorrow. At the internet level, the standards that are developed are very international, so they're very high up on the axis, the vertical axis. But it's mostly done by non-governmental organizations, and so it's very close. It's very much to the left-hand side of the horizontal axis. We have cybersecurity, which is kind of a mix. We have cybercrime, and I'll speak in more detail about this later. It's a very, because it's a law enforcement issue, it's a very much a governmental activity, governmental responsibility, so that's pushed off to the side of the axis. In the case of the Council of Europe Convention to combat cybercrime, it's a very international instrument, so it's sort of at the top of the axis. But you begin to see that if you break down these issues, they don't line up conveniently. They don't organize themselves neatly. And so you have to really look at these in their piece parts. And that was part of the problem at the beginning of the Internet Governance Forum, because each of these things was kind of considered in its own silo. Okay, well, we've got domain name and critical internet resources here. We'll look at those. We've got cybercrime over here. We'll look at those. And there wasn't much in the way of cross-fertilization, cross-pollinization. A lot of what Hank and I are dealing with in the paper is how these domains react with each other, how they interrelate with each other, and we'll explore some of those later in the presentation. Now, from my perspective at the World Bank, a lot of what I do in my day job is advise governments on their legal frameworks to address these issues. And because cybersecurity or internet governance issues are so manifold, because you can't approach it as a sort of monolithic whole, approaching it from a legal reform perspective also poses its challenges. And this is another way of looking at the same set of data, but from the perspective of legal reform. So pay attention to the third column, what I'm calling the legal dimension column. So telecom liberalization of infrastructure is primarily an activity that is done by governments. It's a policy activity, and it results usually in a law or a legal framework that enshrines competition, that encourages innovation and investment in the sector, licensing of operators, for example. Then you get to things like critical internet resources, CIR, and that includes the domain name system and other things. Now, the main actors there are really non-governmental organizations, and like ICANN, the standards body. And when ICANN issues a domain to a country, so .uk for the UK or .za for South Africa, it does so by virtue of a contract. There's no international law as such that